We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this webinar was produced and attended. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Indigenous people who attended the webinar or who may watch this recording. During the recording of this webinar, we experienced some technical difficulties with the sound. Some parts of the recording have been replaced to improve the viewing experience. The content presented has not been changed. Today's webinar will include an introduction from the Chief Commissioner. There will then be 3 presentations from Commission staff, one on the common forms of corruption, one on local government, and one on reporting. These 3 presenters will form a panel after that and respond to a number of questions that are frequently asked of us when we are delivering training. We'll also open the floor to questions from the online audience. The webinar commenced with an introduction from the Chief Commissioner of the ICAC, the Honourable John Hatzisteros AM. The Chief Commissioner started his address by thanking the audience for the opportunity to speak to them. He went on to say that when he and Commissioners Morell and Lakatos commenced their terms in 2022, the Commission had been in operation for over 33 years. He reflected on his reading of the second reading speech on the ICAC bill, which said that as time progressed, the ICAC would become less of an investigation body and more of an education body. That expectation was never realised. However, one of the things that occurred to the 3 commissioners was that there was a much greater opportunity to engage in education, given the years of experience investigating corrupt conduct. Up to that point, the practice had been to conduct an investigation, disseminate a report and the lessons learnt, and hope that somehow these lessons would ferment themselves into the public sector through some sort of osmosis. There is, of course, much more that can be done and should be done, because what we have seen is problems arising and the risks being manifest on repeated occasions.
The first thing that we undertook to do was to engage in a complete revision of our strategic plan, and hence we developed our strategic plan 2022-2025. That strategic plan will come to an end on the 30th of June. Key aspects of that strategic plan involve taking a risk-based approach, building our educational team, targeting key groups, focusing on targeting reporting, and avoid being seen as a gotcha agency. We wanted to be seen as an agency which was proactive in relaying the lessons learned and the opportunities that present themselves to agencies to be able to improve their resistance to corruption. We also wanted to be a transparent, accountable and approachable agency. I think most of those goals have been well and truly realised in the period that has since taken place. Our education team has now expanded to 5 persons. We've been reaching out to the public sector, particularly those areas that we regard as high risk, and I'm going to give a couple of examples of those in a short moment. We have particularly targeted elected representatives. Those are persons who present high risk because they have high levels of responsibility. They are persons who come with divergent backgrounds, often in areas where integrity is viewed through a different lens than in the public sector. And they're areas where there's a high public expectation as to the accountabilities and in relation to the powers that are being exercised. So the first group that we targeted a lot of our time to was our elected representatives. We produced some materials to assist them through induction processes, and also those state MPs who are exiting Parliament prior to the last election. We produced an annotated code of conduct. We updated that from time to time, and we ensured that the MPs were able to not only read the code of conduct, but actually have, in relation to each of the paragraphs of the code of conduct, real examples of circumstances which have highlighted how those provisions should apply. We've made a point of presenting to MPs at targeted education programs, and one of those will be taking place today through my colleague Commissioner Lakatos. We took a similar approach to local government. This was a much more diverse group, and the risks in local government are very different, in particular because local government representatives are very close to their communities. Opportunities for conflicts of interest are greater. They also have jobs apart from their civic responsibilities. So again, we presented at opportunities such as through a webinar that we did through the local government office. We presented through Local Government New South Wales at annual conferences that they conducted, and we did a webinar ourselves. We've also been highlighting other groups that are in the areas of higher risk that we need to spend a lot of attention on, and those particularly focus around groups that do not report as regularly as they should. What the Commission did was undertake some work analysing the reporting rates of agencies, and we built into that the expectations centred around the amount of activity, the staff, the level of public interactions and matters and variables of that nature. We did some discrete work with some particular areas, such as universities, to really highlight areas where we can make a difference. We sat down with them and had one-on-one discussions to try and improve the reporting rates. All of that has worked, and we've now got a situation where in 2023, 2024, we've seen a 54% increase from our previous year in Section 11 reports, a positive indicator of a corruption-resistant culture. As I said, our aim is to assist agencies to improve their performance. I often say at audiences such as this that our primary aim is not to bring people down, but to lift people up. I hope that you will be inspired by what you're going to learn in these presentations to lift your own performance and lift those of your agencies. Recognising that the environment in which we are operating is changing, the ICAC is in the process of finalising its 2025-2028 strategic plan. This identifies the areas where we expect that there will be a need for us to build on the work that we have undertaken in our last strategic plan, but also adjust our settings to the challenges which lie ahead. In particular, we've now got a new Protected Disclosures Act, which has come into force, and we're seeking to adjust our operating environment to enhance the capacity of people who want to come forward and be protected from any reprisal actions. We also want to focus our attention on those risk areas which we've identified in the course of our researches as still below expectations, particular areas such as universities and some of the state-owned corporations. We want to focus on new corruption risks that are emerging, particularly around foreign interference, grooming behaviours, which in some circumstances can result in persons being drawn into corruption activities in circumstances where they were not actively seeking to engage in misconduct from the beginning, and areas such as affinity fraud, which is a frequently occurring phenomenon, particularly amongst persons of similar cultural and linguistic backgrounds. A big part of our next strategic plan will be to move into a direction where we're not just educating the public, but also educating the wider community. We've already commenced work in that area through our engagement with Multicultural New South Wales and the Ethnic Communities Councils, but we need to go a lot further than that into the broader community. Part of that involves using technology such as that which we are using today to communicating to you today. I hope you feel inspired by what you're going to learn out of today's seminar, and that you will take further action to enhance your knowledge by reviewing the materials that's available on our website and keeping in touch with us from time to time. Remember, as I said earlier, we are here to assist you to understand the responsibilities of the positions that you occupy, but moreover to assist in ensuring that we have a corruption-resistant public sector. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now I'd like to introduce you to the next part of our session. We've got three of our most experienced officers here going to answer some of the most common questions that we get from the audience when we do presentations. But before that, they're going to give us a presentation. First of all, it's going to be Adam Shapara. He's the head of our education section here at the Commission. Adam has courageously volunteered to sit in for Lewis from the program. It was Lewis Rangot, who was the executive director. Unfortunately, he's ill today. He's in hospital. We wish him a speedy recovery, but we've got Adam here, thank goodness, to take his place. We've also got Giselle Tocker, Principal Corruption Prevention Officer, who worked on many investigations, who's going to be giving us a presentation on common forms of corruption from the local government perspective, and Joanne Gamble. Joanne Gamble is our Manager of Assessments, somebody who's responsible for the team who has to assess between 3,000 and 4,000 reports of corruption each year. So it's really great to have her with us today. She's going to be giving us a presentation on reporting corruption. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Adam Shapiro to provide his presentation.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you everybody for joining us today. As David said, I'm standing in for Lewis Rangot today, hopefully you'll enjoy the presentation nonetheless. So let's get started, shall we? So the first thing that I'm going to focus on today really is looking at some of the common forms of corrupt conduct. We put out a publication in June 2024 based on research into our own findings and other sources to look at the common kinds of corruption that are occurring in organisations, but that are generally not of a serious enough level for the Commission to investigate itself, but nonetheless need to be addressed. So we released this publication in June 2024. If you haven't had a chance to have a look at it at this stage, you can, of course, point your phone at the QR code on the screen there, and that will take you to a link to download the publication. It's an easy read and definitely worth having a look at. The idea behind the publication was to help people in the New South Wales public sector understand the nature and the prevalence of this common and systemic corrupt conduct issues that may be being experienced in their organisations. We do highlight the most frequent types of common and systemic corrupt conduct that's reported to the Commission. So it's fine-tuned to what you're likely to see in your workplace. We also don't just point out the problems, we do provide some advice in terms of measures that you can take individually and as an organisation to address some of the risks and controls that need to be in place to manage this common behaviour. We also highlight some key risks and some red flags that will hopefully help you to identify this behaviour in its early stages. It's obviously much better if you can nip these things in the bud rather than allowing them to fester. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. When we think about corrupt conduct, we think it looks a bit like this. We end up with serious corrupt conduct, which is a relatively small amount, and then we have these common forms of corruption that are much more prevalent. So when I'm talking about the serious types of corrupt conduct, I'm talking about bribes and frauds and so on. When I'm thinking about the most common forms of corruption, we're talking about lower level things, lower level credit card misuse, timesheet, people being fraudulent on their timesheets, nepotism in terms of employment and so on. And I'll go through a few of those in just a moment. But really when we look at it, that serious corrupt conduct, which is the kind of conduct that the Commission ends up investigating, is a relatively small part of the conduct picture in terms of corruption. So when we think about combating corrupt conduct, mostly that's going to reside in agencies and require an agency action to manage these common risks. So let's have a look at what some of these common forms are. So we often find corruption occurring in recruitment. And that might be doing things like misrepresenting the business case to employ somebody, manipulating the selection process to favour a particular applicant. There might be things like nepotism and cronyism, giving jobs to your friends and mates. There can also be inappropriate use of labour hire companies, CV fraud, and so on. So those are the sorts of things we'd be looking at in the recruitment space. And the publication does give some advice on how you can manage those risks. The next area that we look at in the publication is outside employment. And what's common there, of course, is that somebody with outside employment or secondary employment, as some people term it, will have conflicts of interest associated with that secondary employment. A big area, of course, is timesheet fraud, fraud related to rosters and payroll. So that can be a one-off, lie that somebody tells on their timesheet to make it look like they've worked a full day when really they've just done a half a day and didn't really want to put in a leave application, through to, quite systemic timesheet fraud that's been conducted by a whole work crew or whole teams of people. So there's a variety there. We also have, of course, the perennial issues of procurement and contract management. A very large slice of the Commission's investigative work is in that space, but a lot of it goes on at a lower level that the Commission doesn't tend to investigate. So we're talking here about abuse of P cards, order splitting, failing to conduct adequate supplier due diligence, direct negotiations being carried out in a favourable way, manipulation of the competitive process to give an advantage to a favoured supplier, and also situations where we have contractors on board who may have procurement responsibilities that could be clouded by their own personal interests and business dealings outside of the agency that they're contracted to. So there's those sorts of things that are of a concern. We also have the misuse and theft of public resources, so that's something that we do need to be alert to. There can be the misuse of information, that might be finding information, looking at and using information that you shouldn't be accessing, through to providing access to that information to people who seriously should not be getting it. So there's that. There's conduct around information and information management. Of course, the perennial issue of conflicts of interest. While they're not the cause of all corrupt conduct, they certainly feature quite highly. So unmanaged conflicts of interest are things that we do need to address very seriously. And then, of course, we have gifts and bribery, which are often used to influence a public official to use their powers in a way that benefits a particular party. So these common types of corrupt conduct are things that you're likely to see in your organisation and that you need to have measures in place to address. And of course, this publication does provide you with some advice on how to do that. And we do have a range of other publications around particular things, such as conducting employment screening checks, conducting appropriate supplier due diligence checks, various publications on managing procurement and contract management, and so on. So this is a good place to start to see what might be affecting you, but we also have a whole range of advice available to you. One of the problems that we have, of course, is that there's a slippery slope that can be in place. So it's not uncommon for us to see people's conduct escalating. So people might start off doing a lower level fraud or a lower level activity, and then that will escalate into larger and more complex types of corrupt conduct. So there is a slippery slope there, at least in our experience. That doesn't mean that every indiscretion will develop into serious corrupt conduct, but even these smaller indiscretions can have an impact on the ethical culture of the organisation and can make certain types of behaviour appear to be acceptable, normal, and part of how we do business, which do undermine the overall integrity of the organisation and make it easier for people to engage in more corrupt behaviours without it perhaps being noticed as quickly as it should be. Some forms of corruption seem to develop into a pattern, and others are just a one-off. I don't know which way that's going to go. It'll depend on the person and the circumstances. Insider corruption involving financial fraud and bribes tends to start small and then grows, at least in our experience. So that's where that slippery slope comes in. And of course, CV fraud seems to be correlated with subsequent misconduct, things like procurement fraud that follow. I think it's important to think about corrupt conduct as a skill. It's something that you can actually learn to do. And it's not something that we want people to learn to do. So we can also be helping people to learn ways to combat it as well. Remember that today's junior public official is going to be tomorrow's senior executive. So the kind of culture that we're building in our organisation can have a long-term impact over the life of a person's career. What they see as a junior officer can influence how they behave throughout their entire career in the public sector. Finally, don't forget about the counterfactuals. Often people are saying, oh, I do all of this and, there's no corruption. The reality is that many of the activities that we're engaging in now to prevent corruption are stopping corruption from happening. You can't count that. It's not something that you can go, I stopped 27 incidents of corruption this week. It's not how it works. It's important to remember that the actions we take to manage these lower level types of corrupt conduct are really having an impact every single day, and that your efforts in terms of prevention are paying off. You just don't necessarily see it. So with that, I'll finish my presentation and I'll pass you over to my colleague, to Giselle Tocker.
Thanks, Adam. So I'm talking about local government today and what's new in the local government space. So as usual, a lot has been happening in local government. I think anyone who's involved in a local council would know that the Minister for Local Government has proposed a new councillor misconduct framework. The Commission made a submission to this proposal. A lot of people have been asking us what we said. So just to summarise, our central submission was that the Commission doesn't favour moving councillors to an aspirational code of conduct purely. And I guess the main reason for this is under Section 9 of the ICAC Act, a substantial breach in effect of the model code of conduct for councillors meets the threshold for corrupt conduct. So if that code becomes purely aspirational, it means a councillor can only be found corrupt if it's a criminal breach, which really is a lower standard for councillors than other elected officials. So that's one issue that's concerning the Commission. Another few issues are also being proposed. So, for example, a privileges committee to look at misconduct for councillors. We think it's important that that committee is not purely made up of elected officials, but also some people with maybe background in misconduct as well. That would be a good governance measure. Some of the good things that are being proposed, however, are a requirement that councillors who are developers or real estate agents divest themselves of their development interests if they're on council. How that's going to work in practical effect, we'll have to still see. I know there can be issues around who is a developer, how we define developers, and a lot of the misconduct we see, really to be honest, is councillors being friends with developers, not necessarily developers themselves. But it's good that they're looking at proposals and measures to counter development interests in local government. The other major submission we made was to the review of the model code of meeting practice. It was very pleasing to see that a lot of the Commission's recommendations were implemented in that draft that's come out. So, for example, in Operation Tolosa, we recommended that councillors should not be able to progress a development matter unless they have a council officer's report and a recommendation to inform them. That happened in Operation Tolosa, where the council progressed a planning proposal by piggybacking it off another proposal. And that meant really that that proposal had a lower level of assessment and less transparency. So that's a really good measure, and we're glad that a lot of the ICAC recommendations have been picked up in that proposed model code of meeting practice. Now, as a Chief Commissioner, said, we're doing quite a lot in the councillor space as well in terms of presentations. So anyone in the local council may have seen me or some of our other trainers coming up speaking to your councillors. We're happy to do those presentations. If you'd like us to come and speak to your councillors, please contact us. The types of key issues we're finding councillors are asking about are conflicts of interest, which is no surprise. It can be quite a difficult area for councillors, I think, because they work and live in the same area. So often it's quite a nuanced thing. We're also being asked a lot about lobbying. So some concerning lobbying trends we're seeing at the moment, which have come up in Operation Tolosa and Operation Whitney, are situations where councillors are moving motions that are being written by a developer or the developer's planner. This is really problematic because the councillor, in effect, is becoming an agent of the developer. They're often quite technical motions and they're not being shown to council officers beforehand either. There's a lack of transparency because it looks like the councillor themselves have written this motion when they haven't. So we're speaking to councillors about that. We've also seen quite a worrying trend at the moment where councillors are going overseas, paid for by developers. So in the past with overseas travel, the problem used to be that council was paying for it and perceptions of a junket. We find in terms of what's happening, that's not so much the situation now. There's quite good policies that lock down that type of expenditure. But instead, councillors are going overseas and it's paid for by a developer who has interest before the council, and the council doesn't even know in some cases they're overseas. So that's obviously highly problematic, and bribery have occurred, for example, Operation Tolosa and Operation Galley. So probably in terms of the big news about what's happened in local government is that the Commission released its Operation Mantis report in December 2024. In that report, we made corrupt conduct findings against 3 individuals. So 2 council staff members, one was a contingent hire, the other was a manager and a civil works contractor. So it's probably an example of a big thing, not a little thing. There were 2 major scams. The first one involved contingent hire labour. So the actual inside council contingent hire used his company through a subcontracting arrangement that council wasn't even aware of to put on 26 contingent hires. In some cases, they themselves were paid like $33 an hour, where council was actually charged $115 an hour. So clearly council was not getting value for money and conflicts of interest weren't declared. That company actually made over 2 years $4.5 million out of the scam. So it was highly problematic. So you may ask yourself, well, how did this happen? There were a number of control weaknesses there. And probably the first thing that happened is the manager who came into council, who was involved in the scam, was not subject to proper employment screening. So please, if there's anything you remember from my presentation today, employment screening is very important. So a criminal record check was not conducted of that manager. He also lied about his qualifications, which is something we often see. If someone's corrupt, they come into an agency through a false CV and then they go on to commit a major fraud. So really, if proper employment screening had been conducted at the outset and that person was never allowed to enter the agency, the wider corruption would not have occurred. There's also gaps in this person's CV as well, and he was bankrupt as well, which is problematic if you're going to give someone quite a large financial delegation. So with a lot of contingent hire schemes too, where rorting occurs, we often find there's a lack of workforce planning. So really contingent labour should be short-term uses. There wasn't really an involvement in HR, so there wasn't a look at people's capabilities, what roles we actually need, how we should engage people, where they fit within the structure. So that was problematic as well. There was also a lack of segregation of duties in hiring the contingent labour hires. So the corrupt manager really had end-to-end control. He was able to source people, award them work in some cases, and determine their pay. And another problem we saw too was a lack of induction of contingent labour. If someone's really just coming in for a day to maybe fill in a childcare centre, you wouldn't obviously do a complete induction. But if someone's going to be hanging around for a while, it's important that contingent hires are inducted, they know where to report corrupt conduct, and to even recognise they're quite vulnerable in cases they have short-term labour, They may be afraid to speak up if they see something wrong, but if they feel supported, they will. So the second scam involved civil works contracts. The Commission looked at 3 tenders and 15 requests for quotations. In that case, our corrupt people received about $2.4 million. So some of that money wasn't in kickbacks, actually used it to engage someone to do the actual work. And again, the typical problems we saw there were lack of business cases, budgets that weren't tight, the abuse of variations. So we see this thing with lowballing, where someone will quote low and then they make it up on the variations. Variations are awarded that are outside scope, for example. So it's really important that you're tight on your variations and you're tight on your scope of works. So moving along, because as the Chief Commissioner said, we don't like to be a gotcha organisation, we're planning to issue some guidance to the sector as well, largely drawing on Operation Mantis. So we're planning to put out some contingent hire worker guidelines for the sector that hopefully you'll find useful, and also a publication on local government construction projects. So they'll be coming shortly. And now I think I'll hand you over to Joanne Gamble from our assessment section.
Thank you, Giselle. Yep, my name is Joanne Gamble. I'm Manager of Assessments. So just very briefly, the assessment section is the bit of the Commission that receives all new information that comes in the Commission, and we basically decide whether or not it should be investigated or whether we should take some other course of action. So we're really the first point of contact, but we can also help with queries about how to report or just advice, and CP do that as well, corruption prevention. So we're very busy. Last year we dealt with around 3,500 reports last year, and the breakdown of those, about 1,200 voluntary reports. So by voluntary reports, those are people who have just come forward. 24% of those were anonymous, so you don't have to provide your name and details. However, that is helpful to provide that in some instances if we want to get more information from you or we want to tell you what we're doing with your information. However, it's not required, and a lot of people choose to go down that pathway. By mandatory reports, so those are Section 11, and Section 10, Section 11, that just refers to pieces of the ICAC Act. Mandatory reports are principal officer reports, so they have to report corrupt conduct to the Commission, and it doesn't matter whether it's serious or systemic or very low level, it doesn't matter who's engaged in it, but those reports have to be made to the Commission as well. And just to follow on from that, so principal officers, they tend to be in terms of a government department, the secretary, if it's a council, the general manager, and there is no threshold, there's no discretion. So even if an agency or a council believes that we have received a report, they still have to report it to us. And we like those reports early because once you start talking to people involved in a matter, then it could jeopardise if the Commission was to investigate. So we like those to receive those reports quite early. The more information provided to us, the better, because then we can assess it quite quickly. We can assess matters within a week or two, even shorter if it's an urgent matter. You don't need proof for a Section 11 report, and you don't need it for a Section 10 report, a voluntary report. We just need some information. We need names of people, hopefully, what they've done, when they've done it, the amounts involved, if it was a recruitment, the name of the recruitment, if it was a procurement, the nature of the procurement, because as you can imagine, without that sort of information, it would be difficult for the Commission to pursue, to obtain further information about it. So the threshold, I just wanted to stress that, is very low. And I think where some of the confusion might lie in terms of threshold, the Commission only investigates and is only permitted to investigate serious and systemic corrupt conduct. And if I could just bring in the PID Act, it talks about serious wrongdoing. So there's lots of serious terms used around. But reporting is low. Mandatory reporting to us is low. And you don't need to have all the information. I mean, sometimes we get reports and it's not quite clear who has done what, but it's maybe a division or a section within an organisation. So that's Section 11 reporting. So that's mandatory reports within your agencies or councils. Those have to be made to the Commission, and it actually can be an offence not to report. If we find out that a report has not been made, there could be fairly serious consequences of that. In terms of Section 10 reporting, so that's the voluntary reports, those can be made by anybody and they can be anonymous. As I said, a quarter of all our reports are anonymous. If the person's a public official, we will consider whether or not they meet the requirements of being classified as a public interest disclosure. But regardless of whether it's treated as a public interest disclosure or whether it's a member of the public or anybody else, there's protections in the ICAC Act to protect people who might become the victim of detrimental action. So there's quite a lot of protections for people who assist the Commission. And one of the ways people assist the Commission is by making reports to us. It's very easy to report. We make it as easy as possible. We've strived over the years to sort of narrow down what are the key questions, what's the key information that we need right across from both mandatory and voluntary reports. The best way to report that we prefer is an online form. Why do we prefer that? Because it takes you through the sort of information that we're looking for. We're looking for names, we're looking for people, we're looking for the conduct. What exactly did they do and when? Who else knows about it? Do you have any information or documents? You don't have to. We don't expect you to go and be a super sleuth and go and find out evidence. But if you have information or correspondence that supports your allegations, we really like to have that as well. So the online form is quite good. It just takes you through everything that we need to know. You can just email us as well, and a lot of people choose to do that. However, often we find with emails, we have to go back and forth to get the sort of information that would help us in assessing it. You can also call us as well, and you can actually just call us at any time just to query whether or not you should make a report. And I do get a lot of calls from principal officers or people that work for other government organisations or councils, and they're just not quite sure. Generally, I'd say report it. I think it's better to err on the side of caution and report it to us. And there's a lot of information on our website. Just on the top of our website, there's just a button called reporting, and we've got publications and guidelines on reporting to us. And that's just, I've already touched on that. Again, you don't have to provide your name and contact details. And you don't always have the name. Sometimes people tell us it's someone in council or it's someone in procurement or it's someone in ICT. That's okay. But we need something to go on, some sort of specific information. We're also quite interested to know that how you become aware of it. You don't have to tell us that either, but sometimes it's helpful for us to understand that. And if you've contacted other organisations, like some people contact us, they contact the Ombudsman, or they contact the department or the council themselves, it's helpful for us to have that information because we're always interested to know if other organisations are aware and then what they're planning to do. We only investigate 1 to 2% of all the matters we receive. That's very low, and it's deliberately low because we're only permitted to investigate serious and systemic corrupt conduct. So we rely on the rest of New South Wales government to really investigate most of the corrupt conduct within New South Wales. That last point there, other people are aware of the issue. It is helpful for us to know if there are other people that might have other information to assist that would help us in assessing the allegations. Quite often we get asked, well, you know, when we get all this information, what are we looking for? What sort of information? Jurisdiction, that might sound a bit obvious, but it's not always clear, particularly when it involves not-for-profit organisations. Or there are some organisations, some people are within jurisdiction, RSPCA, inspectors within jurisdiction, other people are not, but in certain circumstances, it's not always clear-cut. We're always interested in the public interest and you know, that side of things as well, but that's not probably a critical factor. We're interested to know whether it's serious and systemic. Now, we're not expecting, because serious and systemic is what we investigate. So if we think there's a potential for serious and systemic corrupt conduct, there is a possibility that we will refer that up and we'll commence a preliminary investigation, or we might ask another government organisation or a council to investigate that, and we can do that as well, and we do that in about 10 or 15 cases each year. We will ask a government department, we'll ask a council to investigate, we'll give them a certain amount of time. Sometimes we will suggest that they bring in an external person because we feel it can only be investigated by an independent person. We also consider responsible in role to prevent corrupt conduct. So that's why we do hand a lot of those matters back. However, we ask for hundreds of investigation reports each year. Why do we do that? Well, we want to be assured that the rest of New South Wales Government has the skills and expertise and capability and know-how to investigate, and they're doing so properly, coming up with reasonable findings and also coming up with good recommendations to prevent. We're always focused on preventing corrupt conduct happening. And then I've touched on some of those other ones. And we're also looking at sometimes matters will go up for an investigation because there simply is no way for that government organisation or council to obtain the sort of information that would be required to get to the bottom of the conduct. That could be personal email accounts, bank accounts, and things like that. So in some instances, we are the only organisation that can take it on and investigate it. Just that last point, the likely existence of evidence. I often get asked if a matter like took place a number of years ago or 10 or 15 years ago. There is no limit on we don't stop and say, right, that's over 5 years ago. We won't investigate that, won't do anything with it. However, realistically, the chances of getting evidence diminishes as time goes on, people's memories. So it is a factor we do take into account. And also we're trying to always look to see, can we add some value here to prevent, can we make some suggestions to the systems and processes in organisations? And we also look to see whether another organisation has dealt with a similar issue before. So just lastly, well, it's imperative that we receive reports because the reports we receive and assessments drive everything that goes on in this commission, not just investigations, but in corruption prevention, in the training and their publication. So it's the bread and butter. It's the engine of the commission. So we extract maximum value from all of that information that we get in. We're looking at trends, we're looking at people, what's going on out there, how can we add value, how can we help government agencies and councils. It also helps us identify people that keep cropping up or certain types of behaviours that keep cropping up so that we can begin to delve a little bit deeper. So it's vital that we receive those reports. And ultimately, it just builds integrity within New South Wales government organisations. Okay, I'll go back. So thank you.
Thanks, Jo, and thanks, panel, for those presentations. The next section, and also, thank you for those applauses. Very good job done. Thank you for also bearing with us with the audio. We hope that we've improved that significantly since the start. So thank you again to all the people who've tuned in. Now, we get lots of questions when we do presentations and training for ICAC with you. Some of them are very common. And now, the next section, we're going to put some of these common questions to our experts. And I'm going to get my colleague, fellow senior trainer, Dr. Porter Forrest Lawrence, to put some of those questions to our panel. Welcome, Porter.
Thank you, David. Excellent. And thank you to the audience for tuning in today. We're looking forward to your questions later on as well. But this part of the segment, I will be asking our expert panel a number of questions that we commonly get asked in workshops. So I'm going to start off with some general questions commonly asked in our day-to-day workshops that we run. While we don't get asked the bottle of wine question as we used to, we're commonly asked the following question at our workshops. So Giselle, to ease us into this section of the webinar, can you let us know, is it okay to get a cup of coffee from a supplier or a contractor?
The value of the coffee, but it's the relationship that you form when you sit down with a supplier and have a cup of coffee, and obviously multiple cups of coffee will strengthen a relationship. So the issue is more about conflicts of interest and forming proper relationships. I think you need to be particularly careful too where you have a supplier and they're going to be bidding for work in the future. So be very mindful of those conflicts of interest. Most agencies have policies that don't allow them to accept any gifts from suppliers for that reason.
Public officials are encouraged to conduct background screening to ensure that bad actors don't get positions in government. Can people still be employed in the public sector if they've been found to have acted corruptly? And how do we know if an applicant has been found to have acted corruptly?
Thank you. Well, I wish that people were better at doing that pre-employment screening to ensure that they don't have the wrong people entering their organisations. It is something that does feature in our inquiries quite often. So what I would say is that there's nothing that prevents a person from having employment once a corruption finding's been made against them. Necessarily. There'll be certain roles where a corrupt conduct finding would indicate that they're not a fit and proper person for a role, and that should be determined. But there are circumstances when people are even convicted of crimes where it may be still appropriate for them to hold positions. So there's not a blanket you cannot employ a person with a corrupt conduct finding against them. How do you find out if somebody has one? Well, it doesn't come up in a criminal records check unless they've also been prosecuted for that behaviour. So there isn't really a register of corrupt people per se. One of the things that some organisations do is that they actually have a question in their employment pack which asks explicitly, have you ever had a finding of corrupt conduct made against you in any jurisdiction? And that's one way, at least you're asking that question, and if people provide you with false information about that, it's an opportunity for you to then, if you find out about it, to let them go because they've lied on their job application. So there is that possibility, but it's not a perfect solution, unfortunately.
The Commission receives 3,000 to 4,000 reports of corrupt conduct each year. Some of them are actually corrupt conduct and others aren't. Can you please explain the difference between corrupt conduct and maladministration?
I mean, maladministration is essentially bad administration, so it's flawed, deficient, problematic, bad decision making. And they cross over. For corruption, we're looking for intent, something deliberate. So with corruption, somebody deliberately did something for a personal gain to themselves or to others. There could be an element of maladministration in that those flawed, those deficient, problematic decisions that are made or a process not being followed. We have to look carefully at that to see whether or not that somebody deliberately did that, follow that path, make that flawed decision. And it could be procurement, it could be anything right across the board for a gain. It's not always clear for us. So that's the main difference. It's intent. I often, when I'm talking about corrupt conduct, we're looking for deliberate. Somebody's done something deliberate. It's not incompetence. It's not inadequate training. It's someone who just doesn't know what they're doing. Someone has deliberately done something for a personal gain. The thing with maladministration, it leads to bad outcomes, poor outcomes in terms of money being spent, decisions being made. But for corrupt conduct, that can often be the case as well. So there is overlap. They're not always distinctive, and sometimes when we receive information in, it's not always obvious. We have to dig a bit deeper, look a bit further to see what's going on there. With maladministration, that would be more the ombudsman, and sometimes we will liaise with the ombudsman on matters that seem to cross over corruption and possibly maladministration.
In these times when we're being asked to do more with less, can corruption be justified if it produces the most efficient and effective outcome? What if it can get things done faster and cheaper and to the same standard?
Bit of a long question.
There's a very short answer, and the answer is no. Fundamentally, we are supposed to be making decisions in the public interest. We're supposed to be making decisions fairly. We're supposed to be making decisions in a way that we can demonstrate that we actually are getting value for money. So there's actually a false premise, I think, to that kind of a question. And that is that particular person or that group of people has decided that something is good value for money. What I'm not seeing is evidence of that. So we need to be transparent around those decisions. We need to ensure that we've got good process around those decision-making, with good decision-making processes in place to ensure that we're getting not just what we think might be value for money, but something that we can demonstrate to being value for money. So I don't think you can actually get value for money without integrity, without there being due process, without there being proper scrutiny and transparency around the decision. So the short answer, no. Many reasons why not.
Some agencies seem to appear in an ICAC inquiry quite often. Why do some agencies continually turn up in ICAC inquiries? Can an organisation be found corrupt?
Well, I'll give a bit of an answer. I expect that my colleagues here will also have something to chip in. But I think there are certain types of activities that particular government departments or public authorities are participating in that are just a higher risk, generally speaking. So if you're involved in procurement, contract management, property development, etc., there are certain high regulatory functions. There are certain high risk functions where corruption is going to be more of a problem than lower risk areas. I think, harking back to what Joanne was saying when she was explaining the difference between corruption and maladministration, corruption often occurs in the context of maladministration. So there are all sorts of, poor systems, poor processes, poor management, and so on, which create an environment where corruption is easier to do. So there are organisations that do a better job of conducting their business and create a more, an easier environment for corruption to occur, and others that are more resistant because of the way they've structured themselves and organised the way they do business. And there's also a question around the ethical culture of the organisation. What is the culture like in that place? Does it put up with unethical behaviour and so on at a lower level? Does anybody want to chip in anything else?
Well, I totally agree with what Adam said. Probably the only other thing I would add is that some agencies maybe have more challenging environments than others. So, for example, you take a council, they may have, 30 separate businesses in effect, and coordinating that can be quite difficult, or you've got a lot of stuff out in the field, operating alone, that can also be difficult as well. So I think some agencies have environments that are particularly challenging, really, and also agencies that have, as Adam said, a lot of procurement. I mean, procurement's probably our largest area of corruption at the ICAC. I think that's because procurement's the main way that money leaves an agency. Apart from payroll seems to be relatively good at being down in terms of inbuilt segregations of duty displays. I think it struggle a bit with procurement.
Private family businesses are an important part of the landscape, but is it okay for a public official to employ a family member, as it would be in a family company?
I think that's a nice, easy one. But I think that's what we would typically say is a conflict of interest that should be declared in those situations. Who would declare a conflict and recuse themselves can be a little bit challenging if it's a very short labour market, it's not very deep, and it's an area of particular expertise, but you would still declare your conflict of interest, and there would be a conflict of interest plan and management structure in place to deal with that. So generally speaking, no, that's not significant.
If there are other forms of misconduct occurring in an organisation, such as bullying and harassment, is it more likely that there will be corruption in the organisation?
No problem. Look, there is some organisations have actually looked into this for themselves and identified pockets where there's been a number of issues, including things like timesheet fraud and abuse of workers' compensation and various other things, bullying, harassment, inappropriate use of leave, and also some corrupt conduct in there. So it may well be that an environment that has all of those things going on is probably going to be indicative of a lower level of integrity within that particular part of the organisation. It's not a guarantee that there will be corruption, having said that, but it does indicate that there may be broader issues in the organisation that create a vulnerability to corruption occurring. Some people, of course, do use things like bullying and harassment to cover their tracks, to keep people at arm's length, to not get the level of oversight and transparency around the decisions that they're making. So it is a tool that a corrupt person might use to cover their tracks. Anything else? Okay, there we go.
I could just maybe add that we do get a lot of reports and they have elements of that, and we do look carefully to see whether or not, I know this sounds a bit odd, the purpose. We're trying to see, well, why bullying harassment is obviously wrong, but sometimes it can be very deliberate, as Adam said, and we quite often are looking to see why. And often there can be a pattern in certain organisations, and I think that could suggest poor operational management. It's not being properly dealt with or managed. And even though that's not strictly for us, we might refer some of that information to the organisation and suggest they do something about it.
I think there's also been some research that's shown that that certain issues such as bullying and harassment, when those things are actually reported and dealt with, there may actually be an element of corruption that's missed when those reports are being dealt with. And so that's another thing that's important for HR people in particular and managers. If you are dealing with complaints about bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, any of those sorts of things, there is the potential that there could actually be a piece of corruption that's kind of being masked by that as well, and that we do need to address and would need to be reported to us.
We need to ensure value for money when we procure goods and services. When we use a company we've used before that we know delivers value for money, we sometimes get accused of favouritism. What do you propose?
Again, I'm going to say, how do you know that you're getting value for money? That's the first point. So if I'm asking that question, how do you know whether or not what you're getting from your ongoing contractor is value for money, then other people are going to be asking that question too, and that'll be often at the centre of why people are concerned. Just because if we can't demonstrate that value for money, we've got a problem. So the important thing around these sorts of things is to ensure that you have due process around your procurement. And if you are ending up using a particular supplier over the long term, there does need to be a going back to the market at various points, reasonable separation between, to ensure that you are getting genuine demonstrable value for money. It may well be that you engage the particular person at a particular time when there really wasn't another supplier in town who could do the work for you to the same level. But 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, that may well have changed. And so your perception of it being the value for money solution may actually be wrong.
I could just add something to that. One of the things, we do get allegations about favouritism or nepotism and somebody being given work when they weren't the best supplier. And we do make inquiries in some of those matters. And often we're looking for paper trails. We're looking for decision making. So you think it's value for money, as Adam said, but what on what basis did you make that decision? And sometimes we go asking for that information. It's not there. People say it is, but they don't have any documentation. A proper process hasn't been followed. So that's why it's so important that you can stand over your decision, even if it does deviate from a process or procedure, that you're able to stand over it. And the only way you can do that is if you have a record of the rationale for that decision.
Absolutely, that's a really key point. Absolutely key point, keeping good records around those decisions.
Yeah. I think on that too, if supplier performance is particularly important to you, implement a more formalised system too, where you can assess suppliers and there's feedback and it's fair and transparent as well.
What can I do to make sure that we don't give contracts to dodgy contractors, suppliers or consultants?
That's a good question. Just a quick one. We have a supplier due diligence publication, which we put out a couple of years ago. That's available on our website and it goes into a lot of detail on this issue. So I think supplier due diligence is based on risk. Your level of due diligence depends on the risk of the procurement. There's some basic things you can do which really everyone should do. So is a supplier genuine? Obviously on the ASIC website you can look for things like Australian company numbers, ABNs. If your procurement is particularly complex or risky, and suppliers new to form, that could be a red flag as well. Maybe they've been formed for a corrupt purpose, or do they have the depth of experience to do the procurement that you need to be done? There's also other things you can do. So there's a lot of information out there. Verify New South Wales has a list of licenses, that type of information. There's referee reports. Sometimes we're asked, if you're on a tender, can you go beyond a tender as nominating referees? We'd say if you're planning to do that, that should be made clear up front in your tender documentation so everyone's quite clear on what the process is and there's no surprises for everyone and you stick to your process. And there's also other types of checks you can have done as well. There's companies that do this for you. So how financially solvent a company is, do they have outstanding debts, is there a cash flow issue? So for a large construction project, that could also be something that you need to look into. But there's a lot of information in that publication that I mentioned.
Some of my colleagues think that there's no chance of corruption if we allocate work to a company off a pre-qualified scheme. Is that right?
No, because we do receive reports of corrupt conduct involving people who have, or companies that have come off those schemes. I mean, I understand that there are obviously there are benefits in saving time and being more efficient and effective from using people who are on those schemes, but there could be issues with the schemes in themselves in terms of the lack of oversight, and there could be even conflicts of interest within those schemes, and they can create opportunity just like any other mechanism for procurement, for nepotism and cronyism, and basically not delivering value for money. And it does depend on panels as well. So no, it's not a protection. It doesn't mean that there might not be corrupt conduct in a company that comes up one of those.
What are some of the procurement red flags to look out for that might indicate that corruption is happening?
Thanks, Porter. Well, I started at the ICAC many years ago, and the first corruption job I did involved a local council procurement officer who was in a corrupt relationship with a contractor, and this was for purchasing below the tender threshold. For every job, this contractor was the last one to quote, and the information about the other quotations was supplied to that person from the procurement officer. So it used to be an old trick of auditors back in the day when they were doing audits to always look and see, does a person who quotes last always get the job? That scheme may not be as common now, given we have e-tender sort of boxes and that information tends to be more locked down, though we still see it from time to time. Other common procurement red flags are things like order splitting. So as everyone knows, you split an order into multiple amounts, so that way you state higher scrutiny that may come on tender. So that's another thing to look out for. There's things like awarding things to $2 companies, so adequate due diligence hasn't been done. Other things that we've seen more recently are situations where the tender documentation doesn't match. So there may be a selection criteria in the tender pack that the schedules that tenderers are meant to fill out don't actually match that criteria, which creates a lot of fuzziness and allows decisions that can't be justified to be made. There's not locking down confidential information from tenderers, tender reports that don't really have a lot of useful information, that don't discuss, for example, clarification processes. Sometimes we've seen a clarification process used as an opportunity for someone to actually change their bid amount, which shouldn't occur. So they're probably the key issues that we're seeing at the moment.
Okay.
Conflicts of interest are often at the centre of corrupt conduct. When does a professional relationship need to be declared as a conflict of interest?
So we define a conflict of interest as occurring when a reasonable person would perceive that a public official's personal interests could effectively interfere with the conduct of their duties, right? So what we'd be looking for in a professional relationship is whether there is that personal impact. So does that relationship amount effectively to a private or personal interest? So in a professional environment, you may well be, say, have a professional relationship with a supplier or a contractor, and it might be purely commercial from their perspective and your perspective, but there still is the potential for that to to have some sort of an influence on you if, for example, they are always your I'll save your bacon kind of person. Now, there are other circumstances where you might have two public officials even who are, well, not friends necessarily and don't socialise, don't have any connection outside of work, but they depend on each other to further each other's either internal political or interests or delivery of what they want to achieve in the workplace. And so that relationship, although quite professional, ends up taking on a personal aspect in terms that it can influence. I need to scratch your back because you're scratching my back on getting this thing done that I want to do. So there's those sorts of things that can cause cause there to be a conflict of interest. Any other ideas?
I think probably an easy thing, or an easy thing agencies can do is, in recruitment at least, require people to declare associations, so they don't have to actually make a judgment about whether it reaches a level of a conflict. And often we see those associations declared because people are applying for the job, especially if there's an internal, so it brings a level of transparency and it allows others to make the assessment about whether it reaches a level of a conflict.
Yes, I agree with that. I think people often get too hung up. Is it a conflict? Is it not a conflict? It's just better to think of it in terms of an interest. Do you have an interest? Do you go to that club? Kids go to the same school. It's probably better just to always err on the side of caution, just declare it. And then that's up to whoever else in terms of how that should be managed. Because if you don't, then there is that risk that by not declaring it, there could be a perception or the reality of something going down. So it's just better to protect yourself, to just declare and not get too hung up as to whether it actually is a conflict that might mean that a certain management plan has to be put into place.
Yes, absolutely. I think I totally agree with both of those comments. I think if you're having a conversation with yourself about whether or not you've got a conflict of interest, don't waste your time having that conversation. Just fill in the form. Otherwise you're going to be dreaming about it tonight. It's going to be keeping you awake. Fill in the form, err on the side of caution. You don't get into trouble for disclosing a potential conflict of interest that ends up not being one. It's much better to err on the side of reporting.
I live in a small town and I know nearly everyone. Do I really have to disclose a conflict of interest when everyone knows I know the people I deal with?
First of all, you have to disclose all conflicts of interest. Whether knowing someone reaches the level of a conflict of interest, I think, is probably a more interesting issue there. So at the Commission, we say there's a difference between just being friendly with someone and being friends. It can depend on your wording of your code of conduct and also the common law. So under the common law, the test about whether a friendship is a conflict of interest depends on the nature of the relationship, the intensity, depth and duration of the relationship. So those are other sorts of things you should be asking yourself. So typically at the ICAC, when we're assessing whether a relationship reaches a level of a conflict, we look at things like, do the people socialise together? So do they exchange private communications? Their children know each other? They exchange gifts? Those types of things. Is it a relationship of trust? What are the reasonable perceptions of others of the relationship? And do they maybe have hidden communication? Often in corrupt matters involving a conflict of interest, communication is hidden from other people, and there's a reason people are hiding that communication.
In what circumstances should I report lies in a job application to the ICAC?
Well, if you formed a view that information on an application form is untrue or false or made up, and this primarily would probably relate to experience that someone has put down or the qualifications, then you should report it. And it also does depend where you've got that information from. But we do receive reports like that, and you should report it if you believe that something's false. How you came about knowing that, you could be related to somebody, you could be connected to the panel, you could be someone who hasn't got the job and somebody else did get a job. So it really, yes, you should report it. It's probably better to err on the side of caution. If you think that's the case, you should report it to us.
Just a follow-up question. Can someone get in trouble for not reporting suspicions of corruption?
That's interesting. It would very much depend on the circumstances, on what it is that should have been reported potentially to us, and also the reasons for not reporting. But overlooking suspicious behaviour, including corrupt conduct, is problematic in itself because it allows that sort of behaviour to fester. So if there was something quite serious that you saw was going on and potentially corrupt conduct and you were aware of it and you didn't do anything, yes, there could be consequences for that. And I think you're going to ask me a bit about Anonymous. So, I mean, if you were concerned, I think it leads into that question well. If you are concerned on repercussions to yourself, you can report information anonymously. You don't have to give us your details. You can just put it in an online form and deal with it and give us everything that you have, and we'll take it from there.
Excellent. Thank you, Joanne. Question on local government over to Giselle. We sometimes hear from public officials about work pressures. We do get questions like this. I feel pressure from above to change my development assessment to align with what a developer wants. I know this is wrong, but I'm scared I will lose my job if I don't do it. What can I do?
Giselle started her answer by saying that the particularly problematic part of the question is changing an assessment to provide what a developer wants as opposed to legitimate differences of professional opinion.
In those situations, you can say to your boss, I don't want to put my name on this assessment, can you sign it? And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. I guess the particularly concerning part of this question is that the motivation appears to be to please a developer, which would put the conduct in the realm potentially of corruption. So I think in those situations, you should make a report. You can report to the ICAC. You can make a PID internally as well. There may be a trusted person who's quite senior within your organisation, like the internal auditor is often a person that receives information as well. And I think it's really important to make a file note. So there's many situations where I've seen a public servant make a file note. I've never seen a public servant being found corrupt who's made a file note. It can be your best friend, so I'd be making a file note as well as reporting it in those situations.
Okay. Is corruption getting worse in New South Wales? That's the whole panel there.
Yes. I'll start and maybe other people can chime in. I don't think it's getting worse. I think it's changing. So I've been working in this area for the last 18 years. I don't think it's getting worse, but it's very hard to know because there's not a baseline. You can't measure how much corruption is going on. It's a secret activity. People are hiding it. So we don't really know. You can never really know how much is going on. But what I have noticed over the years is that the complexity of the conduct has increased. People's skill at doing it, to some degree at least, has increased, and people are using new and different ways of engaging in that conduct over time. I'm not sure that there's more, but I think we're getting better at finding it, and it's becoming more sophisticated, and we are more sophisticated. If you look at what we cover in our investigations now in comparison to what we did, 15 years ago, it's quite different, I think.
I think Adam summed it up well. I think, like back in the day, you'd see a corrupt person just take a bribe and go put it in their bank account. That rarely happens now. Instead, there's a whole layer of subcontracting upon subcontracting and trust and money moved around. So it's definitely become more sophisticated. I think procurement's more sophisticated. The government's getting into more sophisticated schemes like, shared risks and rewards with contractors. So there's a whole level of complexity. But as Adam said, our tools are getting better as well. And I think it'll be quite interesting too to watch how AI evolves with investigating corruption in the future.
Is there a correlation between current trends in corruption and your corruption prevention activities?
Look, I think yes, in that, yes and no. We're always looking for what's happening and what the trends are, and then trying to respond to that by, updating what we cover in our training, doing presentations on emerging issues, putting out publications on those things, keeping those things up to date. And I think certainly we've seen some changes in behaviour inside organisations in terms of them doing work to improve their systems, processes, focus on building integrity and so on. So I think there is, I don't know if there's a correlation, but there is a connection.
That's true. I mean, there's always your bread and butter issues. We're always going to have procurement fraud, I think, but we also look at what's trending. So, for example, last year we put out something about counsellors and overseas travel because we found in a lot of our investigations, counsellors were going overseas paid for by the developer. So we try and plug the gaps about what's new and emerging as well, but some things are always on the agenda.
think when we get matters in, we're always looking for a corruption prevention angle. So we would flag those matters when they come in for our corruption prevention team to have a look at in terms of the context of the work that they're doing. So it's always on a horizon what's going on. So obviously it will track the information we get in will pretty much the corruption prevention work will track that sort of the trends and the information we're receiving.
We also have our strategic intelligence people who are interrogating large data sets and various other things to spot some of those trends so that we're not just responding to complaints that come in or reports that come in. So we are doing that proactive work as well. And also we engage with various organisations to sort of see what's on the horizon for them as well. So it's not just reactive to what's happening. We are trying to be more proactive over time as well.
Great, thank you very much. Another question is, what happens after an inquiry?
After an inquiry, Giselle says that we follow up on the implementation of our corruption prevention recommendations with the agency that was the subject of the inquiry. If we believe there's been criminal activity, we put together a brief of evidence for the Director of Public Prosecutions. We also hit the speaking circuit and invite ourselves to conferences and various agencies to present on the key corruption prevention lessons.
Currently, we're doing a round of our Operation Mantis inquiry, so everyone gets to learn the lessons from an inquiry. If it's an issue that's trending too, we will also put out a better practice publication as well.
And I think we're also experimenting with some new things. So, for example, Commissioner Morell did a video on Operation Mantis that just encapsulated the findings and the issues. But then there's also the recommendations that we make as part of that inquiry process, and agencies are then expected to let us know whether or not they are going to accept those recommendations and how they're going to implement them, and then they're required to give reports on their progress at 12 and 24 months as well. We can't compel them to do anything, but there is a very strong moral obligation, I think, placed upon them to act on those recommendations that we make as part of that public inquiry process.
Will a bad culture always defeat a good process?
That's a good question. In short, not necessarily, but it doesn't help.
A good process in and of itself isn't going to solve the problem. You generally need a combination of a good culture and good systems and processes. So we're always striving to find a way to have to track these things on the basis of having reasonable compliance with good systems and processes, but also be doing the work to build the values in the organisation that make people want to do the right thing, even if there's a bad process.
That's true. I think sometimes a bad culture can bubble along, but then it can come crashing down with something like an ICAC investigation. So sometimes we know something's a problem, or it can appear to be a problem, and things eventually have a way of coming out, I think.
That's right. And one of the reasons why we've wanted to focus today in the presentations on the lower level kinds of corrupt conduct is that if you actually focus on these things and you nip these things in the bud, you're much less likely to face an ICAC inquiry. We don't want to come and investigate. What we want to do is to help you make that not a necessary thing. And one of the ways you can do that is by addressing these lower level types of corruption, building a strong culture of integrity in your organisation, and creating an environment where people really struggle to engage in corrupt conduct.
Thank you again to the panel, Adam, Giselle, Joe. Thank you to the Commissioner, Chief Commissioner, for his presentation earlier on. We're here to help. Advice at icac.nsw.gov. Free advice, the best advice you'd get for corruption prevention. That will have to leave it for today. Thank you very much again for your patience, and have a great rest of the day.